Okay, so quite the um, gourmet options of builds tweaks coming out of the new test server with the next update. So quite a few things that are cool and very excited for if they do make it into the live builds. I'm not going to quite go through everything because the main component um, of this video, what I'm going to be looking at an analysis, is going to be explicitly about the cabin speed tweaks. Everything else I don't really have any immediate issues or concerns with, but as comment section here is showing, people are quite upsetty with primarily the speed tweaks. So it's something that I feel like is worth going over, and I'm not going to pretend I'm necessarily the best person to do that, nor can I speak on behalf of Targum or Gaijin or whatnot, and in regards to sort of what is or isn't what they're trying to do, but just sort of my thoughts on the matter, and from a person who has gaming experience, who has spreadsheeting analysis experience, who has design experience, sort of what I think they're trying to do um, with this. So, yeah, this is probably going to be a relatively dry video, especially because the rest of it is now going to be looking at spreadsheeting. So, to begin with, this is just taking a look at the technology tree for Crossout. So anytime you go into the game, go into factions, go into tech tree, look at cabins, and then have all of the filters off so you see all of the cabins. Um, this is somewhat what you'd be looking at. So this is just a mock-up that shows the speeds of the vehicles in kilometers per hour. So, for instance, this is the Duster cabin, which I believe is actually a console exclusive. It has a speed currently of 95 kph. This is the new Hadron cabin, which has a speed of 80 kph currently. So this is the general breakdown. Currently, you'll note that a couple of numbers are actually in red. That's because these are speeds that are improperly listed on here. So that corresponds to the master cabin at 95 and the huntsman cabin at 75. So in here they have it listed as a buff for the huntsman of 75 instead of 70 and a nerf to the master of 95 instead of 100. However, based off of currently not only what's in the game on Xbox, but as well as my ultra outdated cabin spreadsheet. So for instance, this doesn't even include the master listed on it yet because I haven't kept up to date on it. But you can see that the kph speed value of the huntsman is 75. Likewise, if I open up the patch notes for the master when it released, which I'm not going to do because I'm not going to poke around with all the other tabs here. But it was 95 on launch, and yet they have it listed as being changed to 95, which is just what the red is supposed to indicate. So there's a couple of very interesting points on this when you actually break them down into categories. And again, I'm sure this is something that the system designers sort of do behind the scenes already. For the sake of this analysis, because there is such a wide spread of speeds, especially in the first three tiers, I'm actually going to be ignoring these. I feel like it's fair that anybody who feels significantly miffed about this is primarily looking at cabins in the epic and legendary tier, because those are almost exclusively what you are going to be seeing in endgame content. And even in something like arena, which is incredibly min-maxed by people, I haven't really seen a whole lot of growl cabins outside of, or for what that's worth, any epic or sorry special or lower tier cabins, other than when people are seal clubbing, which is kind of its own discussion I've talked about in the past. I feel like the growl should be a 10 energy cabin, like others of its tier. But in any case, while there are some changes to these lower three tiers, I felt like it would crowd this list significantly without adding much value, as well as require the introduction of some additional tiers that I didn't particularly care to go through. So for instance, you can look at some of the alternative rare cabins, which actually have a spread of 75 to 85, even though the special tier only has 70. So yeah, it complicates the graph quite a bit. Likewise, there's the Carapace cabin, the tank cabin, which is 50, which is like super far off to the side. So again, I'm just going to be ignoring that just for the sake of making this hopefully a little bit easier to digest. And then once again, because we're primarily, or at least I am, looking at the end game implications of these changes. An interesting thing to note, if you've never seen this sort of mock-up or have not memorized all of the speeds of cabins before, is there are certainly a few outliers in the current system. So there is a medium cabin that's 100, there's a medium cabin that's 60, and there's some heavy cabins that are 70, which is close to medium. So again, there's a considerable overlap currently, I feel, in the different flavors of cabins. So while there's going to be a lot of difference as far as shape and size and durability and mass, especially power, tonnage between the devices, I think it's fair to consider all of those as being static for the purpose of these changes, because those are not being tweaked at all. We're only looking at the speeds of cabins in relation to before and after the update. So I've kind of broken these all into 5 kilometer chunks, sort of, for what the cabins currently are in their current state. And again, this is for epic and higher cabins. It's interesting to note this isn't actually something I explicitly tried to do by going, okay, we'll have a 105, a 195, etc. Category. That's just kind of how it worked out, which again, I'm sure is very much purposeful design by whatever system designer Targum or Gaijin has. But in any case, if you look at the different weight categories, I guess you could say, for the cabins, each of them has their own within general parameters. So of course the light cabins are generally faster than the medium cabins, are generally faster. Medium cabins, doing a terrible job of selecting, but are faster than the heavy cabins. And that's a very easy way to look at it. So for somebody who, again, hasn't looked super in-depth at it in the past, typically when you go up in tier, you get an increase in speed slightly in some cases, slightly less in some others. It's basically a bit of a spread. But you effectively have more options as you go up in most cases. Likewise, there's sort of a hierarchy in between the in the category of each weight class. So I would have liked if they had physically represented this a bit better. So originally, for instance, when we didn't have the aggressor cabin or the dusk cabin, and it was just the cockpit cabin on the far left, we kind of had this overall flow to the entire table where you had like your fastest vehicle on cabin on the far left, and then as you went to the right, it sort of decreased, and you can kind of see this still being true. So if you look at the rare cabins, if you look at most of the medium cabins, and then especially if you look at the heavy cabins, that's no longer the case. So these categories aren't exactly intuitive, I don't think. You can even look like there's a very wide spread of 100 kph everywhere in this light cabin list, where there doesn't really seem to be a whole lot of progression, at least not as noticeable as the other categories. So I feel like it could be represented better. Likewise, I feel like it would have been easier to sort of show this like category change rather than this spam of text of all the cabins, their new speeds and their old speeds. Because again, I feel like this is sort of bulky and unintuitive and harder to digest. But in any case, what I've listed as the label for the categories, of course, is completely subjective. People might have their own terms for them. The dev team might have their own internal terms for them. This is just sort of what first came to my mind with them. So to start with, on the far left, we have the ultralight category, quote unquote. So this is currently only the cockpit and aggressor cabin. So unlike the rest of the light cabins, or at least most of them, as you can see, there are still 295s that run 100 kph. These guys run 105 kph. So it's a little bit redundant almost, because the cockpit cabin is running generally boosters for its perk to activate anyway. But nonetheless, as a direct consequence of having the speed cap on them of being 105 rather than 100, that means that they're actually able to hit the vehicle speed limit or the engine speed limit of 120 kph, pretty much with just a hot red. So I believe it's actually like 1 kph off, so 105 times the speed boost of the hot red, which is 1.13. Yeah, it sets you up at 119. I'm assuming that's exactly without rounding. Yeah, it's pretty fucking close in any case. So and if you fuse the cabin, the hot red, for a speed increase, especially, then you're hitting that engine speed cap without having to use a engine that requires energy, whilst all of the light cabins are just 100, which means that if you want to hit the speed cap, then you're going to require the Cheetah engine, which is a 20% speed increase, which 20% of 100 gets you to 120. Or you could use the Oppressor, which has a speed increase of 17%, which again, if you fuse that for speed, kicks you up to the 119-ish limit. Now, it's important to note, I don't know how clear this is going to show up for everybody, and especially, of course, I know people sometimes have limited like ranges of colors that they can look at. So this might actually be terribly jarring for people, and I apologize for that. In any case, the colors are just matching the tier of the cabin, and then the name is written in black text in all cases. So for instance, all of the epic cabins are labeled in purple, and all the legendary cabins are labeled in orange. So this is Dusk, Tusk, Blight, Cerberus, Jannavi, Werewolf, Harpy, Deadman, all are epic cabins. Now, it's interesting to note that there's the Torero here at the bottom as well. So it has its little asterisk. And the reason that is because this isn't actually a light cabin. It's the medium cabin listed over here. So it's I think it's based off of a supercar of some sort. People say Lamborghini or whatnot, or at least that's what they make a hell of a lot of exhibition art builds for. But in any case, it's a medium cabin that has the speed cap of a light cabin, or at least historically has had the speed cap of a light cabin. That's going to be changing with this update if, again, they go through and don't change anything further. So light cabins in general have a higher power score than medium cabins, in addition to their lower mass, tonnage, durability, size, shape, etc., which means that while the light and medium categories both offer 12 energy for weapons, modules, etc., the light cabin will have a higher quote-unquote cost via the power score system. On the flip side, heavy cabins are kind of shafted because while they have higher durability, tonnage, etc., they actually don't have a 12th energy point. So heavy cabins have 11 energy and the same power score as medium, and the light cabins have higher power score with the same energy point as medium, which is to say basically medium cabins are kind of, I don't want to say they're categorically broken because again, I can't comment directly on that as somebody who's not like doing a lot of in-depth analysis on this on like the day-to-day or like tracking how cabins perform against each other, anything crazy like that. But just on paper, having a category that has middling mass, middling tonnage and size and all the other irrelevant stats that aren't really on this page, whilst having the additional energy point that heavies don't have, whilst not having the additional power score penalty that light cabins have, kind of sets mediums up for a bit of higher success in general, I think. I mean, they are meant to be the, well-rounded cabins, but in any case, the Torero takes it a step further and is as light as a fucking light cabin, with its speed whilst maintaining the tonnage and max mass of a medium cabin. Which is to say that for something that has a perk that affects almost literally every weapon in the game, the Torero cabin is kind of like, again, on paper, broken. It basically has the benefits that all categories have to offer without any of the negatives. So I think this is long overstanding that the Torero is getting bumped off of its throne of being pretty much the best at fucking everything. But yeah, otherwise, even just looking again at this first sheet, if you hadn't looked at this before, considered this before, the Torero was a extreme outlier and incredibly crazy for where it was positioned. So that's been quote unquote corrected with the next update. We'll get to the next update when we're done going through the list here. In any case, the last one in the light category is the Master Cabin. So again, it's interesting to note that this is currently the only 95 outside of the Duster Cabin, which is only a common tier. And it's listed as being a 100 kph cabin in the patch notes, which leads me to believe that somebody fucked up somewhere and it was supposed to be 100. I don't know, maybe they were testing the effectiveness or popularity of the cabin as a result of making it 95 out the gate or whatnot to start with. But in any case, I assume this is some sort of an error or testing. It doesn't seem that it would be in its own category just to begin with on like just a purpose design decision to make it slightly slower. In any case, moving on to the medium cabins, we have what I have referred to historically as the pseudo-light cabins. So technically, I normally have the Torero here, but for me describing what a pseudo-light cabin is. But for the sake of this analysis of breaking it into kphs, I mean, it's obviously 100 kph rather than 90, which again is a pretty sizable speed increase considering how the 90s are already faster than all of the other medium cabins. In any case, this includes the Favorite and the Howl, which are incredibly popular cabins already alongside the Torero, as well as incredibly expensive, at least on Xbox. So again, it should be no surprise that part of the reason for it, other than their rather powerful perks, is because they, again, have higher speed caps than most of the other cabins in the game, including other mediums within their own category. It's interesting to note this also includes the Quantum, which I literally had never noticed up until this point. Again, if we go to ye old spreadsheet for all the cabin stats, yeah, so I had it recorded, but I just never noticed it out the gate. And part of that is probably because of the incredible niche use of it. But as a result, it sort of makes sense because it wants to avoid things whilst having the semi-higher mass limit of other cabins. It's sort of one that's been an outlier because you don't really see a whole lot of it. But it makes sense as a pseudo-light cabin again, so it has a little bit less mass and tonnage than its other contemporaries, and as a result it has higher speed. And certainly it's the kind of perk that benefits from being able to hit and run or get away from enemies faster. Next category over is the quote-unquote semi-lights, so this is just the Call and Beholder cabin. It's interesting to note that the 3 legendary cabins currently all have their own tier of speeds. I assume that's very much on purpose, and maybe in the future the next medium cabin is as a result going to be something that falls into this category, or at least would if we had followed this sort of system continuing. Likewise, legendary cabins over here spread out, legendary cabins over here spread out, so could expect an ultralight. Legendary cabin could expect a pseudo medium. Legendary cabin, I don't know, but in any case it's not really what it seems to be anymore. And in any case, again, sort of makes sense. Call is, again, focused on mobility, especially as a drone exclusive cabin. I guess actually, is it drone exclusive? But technically also turrets, but I lump those in the same category. And the Beholder is just a basically cabin with 17 quote unquote energy using cloaks. So again, it kind of makes sense to be a little bit faster for the sake of not having as long a cloak time as literally just using the special module. For the true mediums of the class and the very small list considering, you have the Ghost, the Photon, and the Hadron at 80, the Hadron being a new addition. Pretty straightforward. It's exactly halfway between most of the lights and most of the heavies, which is 160 kph respectively. And then to its right, we have the semi-medium. So you'll notice that there's a tilde here, approximately 75. That's because whilst the Nova is actually a 75 kph cabin, the Omnibox's perk allows it to go up to 77 kph in some situations, although most people who are using it are going to leave it in the 70 kph mode. At the same time, I don't really feel like its other stats are indicative of it actually being like a pseudo-medium cabin or of the heavy cabin caliber. Likewise, we already have some other 70s, of course, in the lower tiers. I feel like it's fair to say it's around 75. And again, of course, when you end up slapping on a equivalent engine between these two, they become the most similar anyway. So moving on to the heavy category, we have the pseudo-medium. So this is the Echo, which has been, again, a rather extreme outlier from its contemporaries. So for the lighter sized heavies in general, so faster speed, lower tonnage, lower mass, etc., we've had these 3 cabins, with the Yokozuna being the most recent addition as the legendary component of it. So you could almost lump these together. I haven't, again, for the sake of being the 5 kph difference, and also because how it gets restructured a little bit in the next page. But in any case, the Echo cabin is extremely popular due to its perk and due to its speed in pretty much any tier. I mean, you can't really seal club with it, although I don't know why you'd want to anyway. But in any case, it's it's fast as fuck, boy, but it's not actually fast enough to really be considered a medium, and it certainly has a lot more mass than them. So to put it in perspective, the Echo cabin, if I just open it up here, has a max mass of 18,000, whereas the Nova, which is category above and in a different category entirely, is 15,000. Now, there's been some conversations in the past, especially ones that I've mentioned, that in theory, the Nova cabin and the Step Spider cabin should kind of be considered as tank cabins alongside the Carapace because they are slower than their contemporaries, whilst maintaining the 12 energy and having a much higher mass limit than them. I'm not, again, going to go super deep into that conversation today, but it's an interesting point that you could kind of take the Nova and again sort of yeet it over to the category to the right. And again, I think as part of the updates, we can sort of see that a little bit more clearly. In any case, for the other heavy cabins, I'll note that the Steppenwolf cabin, so this does actually include the Jawbreaker as well, does have a range again, just like the Omnibox. Reason for that being, and I mean, I'm not applying this to literally every cabin co-driver perk that exists, because likewise, for instance, there is one for the Trucker as well, but that's super not worth using. In any case, the Steppenwolf co-driver Hans offers a perk called Indomitable. So that gives the Jawbreaker, the Humpback, the Bastion, the Cohort, an engine bonus to max cabin speed of plus 5 kph. So this is plus 5 before any other modifiers such as, I'm going to assume fusions, but I haven't actually checked that. But even for engines, so it treats its base cabin speed as 65 kph instead of 60. So you do get a little bit of a range here. And like I said, there is one as well for the Trucker, which is Stone Deaf's last one, which is incredibly expensive. I guess to be fair, it's probably worth including it, even though it's a very saddening one and totally not worth getting. But in any case, again, there's that sort of range for being boostable by co-drivers, where most of the other co-driver perks don't offer that. And again, there's a bunch of other benefits that they do offer, but for the sake of just looking at like speed increases, I think it's a notable mention to separate them from others. And I mean, again, it's directly relevant to what we're looking at. If we were looking at, you know, tonnage and mass as well, then it would be useful to include Bulldogs plus cabin tonnage for the Growl, or including Master Jacks plus tonnage and max mass for everything. But you know, we're not looking at that currently. So in any case, last category is the full quote-unquote heavy. So this includes the Machinist, because as a non-Steppenwolf cabin, it does not benefit from Hans's co-driver buff. And then as another sort of asterisk for a cabin that's sort of outside of its actual category, is the Step Spider. So again, it's a medium cabin. It has lighter max mass than the heavy cabins, although not by a whole lot depending on which one you're comparing, and it does have an additional energy point. It is a medium cabin in classification, although internally at least it's not the case anymore. This is another sort of segue I've talked about before. Originally, when the first cabin fusion event came out, where you only need 2 instead of 3, it shows a list of the items that are included, and the Step Spider was listed as a tank cabin at that point. It wasn't listed as Step Spider, it was like Karatask or something. So I assumed it was some prototype Russian cabin that hadn't been translated yet. I Googled it. It literally translates into a sort of spider that's in Russia. So it's at least internally classified, at least at one point, as a tank cabin, which again is a slower than other cabins in its category, higher mass than other cabins in its category, higher energy than other cabins in its category cabin. And again, that sort of fits within the definition regardless of which category you put it in, but in any case, it has a 60 kph limit to begin with. So they aren't benefited from the Steppenwolf, so in theory, you could sort of eke these guys over here if you don't use the perk, or eke them over here if you do use, or sorry, if you don't use it, or over here if you do use it. But in any case, I feel like it's reasonable to have their own category, because you do have that flexibility in the option. You aren't necessarily tied down to it either way. So if we look at the updates afterwards, and I'm just going to add the Trucker in here again, just for the sake of being complete. Everything that's changed has been highlighted in red. So technically, again, the Huntsman cabin, it went up. I think it's actually the only one here that went up. Of course, it's worth double checking, especially when I have all the information on screen, not to make an ass out of myself. Yeah, so it's the only one that went up. And again, that's not the case. That's actually like, it's that to begin with. So I'm assuming that either it's the same thing as the Master, where like they released it wrong, a while ago or tweaked it or something. It's also possible that they mean that it's going to be dropped down to 70, but I'm going off of the official patch notes. And whilst confusing, we don't have any notes to the contrary, so I can't really operate off of anything else, I don't think, in a fair manner. So everything that's red has been decreased. Because the Huntsman cabin's just black because, like I said, there is the error in it to begin with. Maybe it will be reduced to 70. I don't know. Maybe the Master cabin is also being reduced to 90 or something. I've got no clue. It would sort of make sense because we don't really have a cabin in the 90 kph category right now, but it also doesn't make a lot of sense to make one cabin in its own category. Not like they don't already do that with the pseudolite anyway. But in any case, so you'll see that some cabins certainly shifted around, especially in the medium area. It gets kind of bananas. In any case, to start with, very obviously, to begin with, they basically cut the kph of all light cabins from 100 to 95 if it was a 100 kph cabin, and from 105 to 100 if it was a 105 kph cabin. So, sort of interesting. I sort of have mixed feelings. I did like the sort of, I don't want to call it an Easter egg, but sort of the fact that as a result of design you could use a hot red on some cabins and still reach the speed cap. That's not going to be the case unless, of course, they tweak around this further. But in any case, it does mean that using the fastest engine with the fastest cabins in the game does give you the speed cap without using a fusion for speed, but it isn't going to give a speed cap for most of the other cabins in the game. I feel like that's fair, and now it's sort of more of a hard-coded rule, I suppose. I don't know if they'd plan to reduce the engine speed cap to 115 or something instead, so the hot red sort of maintains its superiority with the cockpit and aggressor, and the cheetah with the other light cabins, or whatnot. Again, this is just my thoughts, analysis, speculation, and isn't, I don't know. They haven't announced anything on it. I haven't heard anything about it. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. I wouldn't be surprised if it happens, but I'm not explicitly expecting it to. But in any case, it sort of cleans up the light category a little bit more. We get the Torero out of the light, quote-unquote, category speed. We get the Master merged, or at least potentially, again, depending on what the patch notes are wrong about, into two categories. It sort of cleans it up a lot more nicely. Moving on to the medium category, obviously the Torero got knocked down a significant amount, so it actually got the biggest speed nerf by going to 85 instead of 100. It dropped 15 kph. Again, I think for reasons that I highlighted earlier, that makes sense. It was sort of its own contender in a lot of ways, and just dropping it by 5 to like 95 or whatnot, I think would still be a slap in the face, especially considering how the other, semi-light cabins are like dropping to 80, which is still rather significant, a 10 kph drop. It's a lot more harsh in general on the medium cabins than the light cabins, but I think that is something I actually approve of, although, again, lots of people are extremely angry on the subreddit about it because of whatever reasons they feel like listing. I feel like it kind of gives the different categories their own flavors a lot more so now that the lights have been toned back, and the mediums especially have been toned back from being very close to lights. So beforehand, you had almost all of them actually within the 80 kph to 100 kph, whilst now it's obviously toned back to, you sort of have a split. Now you have a lot more like medium slow cabins. I feel like it gives a lot better progression. I still feel like there's a bit of a void here in the 90 kph category, whether or not they plan on adding more like pseudo medium cabins at 90, or they feel like leaving this a like notable gap as a result of the speed increase and the power score increase of the light cabins. I'm not sure. In any case, I'm not dissatisfied with this specifically. If we look at the other cabins, this is kind of where we get sort of like a 3-cup game category going on. So in general, if you look at specifically the legendary cabins, you can see that each of them dropped a quote-unquote tier, so 5 kph, but maintained their relative positions. So the Beholder, the Hadron, and the Nova all dropped one quote-unquote tier of 5. The ones in the middle get a little bit more nuanced. So for instance, the Call cabin dropped from 85 to 77. So it only dropped 8 rather than the nice cleaner numbers of 5 and 10. The Ghost cabin became 76 instead of 80, which again is sort of a weird number drop. So as a result, I have the approximately 75 kph range on it again. Likewise, you sort of get the Omnibox in this weird spot because it dropped only 2 kph. It can go from 68 kph to 75 kph. You could almost argue it's like an average between, and it's maybe its own category now here between the medium and semi-medium. I don't know what the intention with it is. Honestly, like, it would probably be smarter to leave it in the semi-medium category because, again, you're primarily going to be leaving it without the speed boost. But in any case, this is a approximately 75. I didn't feel like slapping on the approximately 70 to this. You'll also note that the photon, which at least on the technology tree is the direct step before the Nova, and in fact I believe it's literally linked by a line, so it's shown as the upgrade to it. It requires it in crafting, etc. Is now in the same speed category as it. So beforehand, you actually had the photon be faster. That was a result of the speed decrease, the speed nerf applied to the Nova. On top of getting reduced further with this update, the photon is being brought in line with it, which I think makes sense. So now this line is, for the most part, again, unless maybe this is meant to stay as a 70 again with the Huntsman or drop to a 70, then they're trying to have all the columns sort of maintain the same speed. Again, I can't really speak for that, but in any case, again, it sort of makes sense to lump them together, especially if you're literally saying one is a direct consequence of the development of the other. But yeah, in general, this category, it's kind of so obviously the semi-light cabins get dropped down to include the Beholder, which doesn't get as heavy-handed of a nerf as the pseudo-lights beforehand, but are together, whilst the Call got a larger nerf than the Beholder got yeet down into the category below. So the Epic cabins get shuffled down quite a bit, particularly these ones, but the Coast and the Omnibox don't suffer as much. The Photon gets bumped down. The Beholder sort of stays where it is. So again, I feel like this is sort of a better spread where, again, on top of not eking as close towards the light cabins where we had before, like I said, with all the 90s and 85s, we have it primarily focused in the 80 and approximately 75 kph zone, which, like I said earlier, is exactly where I feel like we want those cabins to primarily be as a result of them being, well, medium and being in between the light and the heavy cabins. So I feel like, again, this is fair. I don't really have any issues with it. I know, again, a lot of people are very vocally upset with this. And of course, I'm not part of the test server. I haven't poked around with these before. While I have used most cabins, I want to say, like, somewhat extensively, how these actually end up changing as far as their acceleration formula or how they actually feel to play around and drive in, I'm not sure. I don't suspect this is going to be a huge like drop off in quality of life or the viability of most of these cabins, like it seems like a lot of people are arguing for. But in any case, again, this is all anecdotal and on paper analysis. It's worth noting, of course, that there is a slight change to the heavy category, but nowhere near as extensive as the others. So we get, again, this is the sort of thing where we sort of get dumb numbers, which I don't appreciate. I'd prefer if they left it in increments of 5, but obviously that's not the case they decide to go with. The Icebox gets dropped from 65 to 63, which is effectively nothing, but I mean, they did it anyway, so whatever. And the Echo cabin is dropped from 70 to 65. So what that basically says is we're actually maintaining this mid-heavy category. Again, it's closer to a lot of the other cabins compared to before where it was a little bit more spread out. And at best, you're looking at 1, maybe 2 cabins. But in any case, so now we can see that this sort of collapsed. So we have basically only 3 categories for heavies now. We have the 60, which is the ones that don't benefit from Hans and aren't faster to begin with. We have the cabins which are faster to begin with. It's worth noting, of course, the Yokozuna's perk of plus 20% speed, which stacks with the engine speed buff, does actually kick you up pretty high. Like you can get up to the 90 kph barrier currently. Again, I don't know if that's purposeful, if they want the Yokozuna to sort of be the only one here because it's a temporary buff or whatnot. But in any case, for just base driving around speed, these 3 are all extremely similar. The Echo and the Yokozuna are tied at 65, and the Icebox is slightly slower at 63. I imagine that's just to maintain the flavor of it being slower than the Echo and the Yokozuna as a result of it not exactly being a speed demon cabin, but like a trucking cabin. And then, of course, we have the sort of flexible options in between, which lets you go in between 60 and 65, depending on your co-driver. So overall, I also missed that being 65, but it is. Yeah, I'm really a fan, honestly, of this. Like I said, other than this whole 90 kph gap, which they may or may not work on filling out, and sort of the weird numbers, um, and ranges, which kind of upset the graphs and or the categories in general. I feel like this is phenomenal for sort of simplifying the different categories that the cabins are in, giving you more expected values for the speeds of things where you don't have the Torero as fast as light cabins. Um, and in general, I feel like it's probably going to be a little bit better for game health having more clearly defined cabins and having things slower in general. So as a result of this, primarily being targeted well, exclusively being targeted at everything 65 kph and above, the heavy cabins aren't as hurt by it. Their potential speed increase with the Hans now has a increased size effect. Although, of course, when you're looking at 5 kph versus 100 or 105 kph cabins beforehand, it wasn't like this isn't a sizable shift by any means, but it still does give them a bit more, um, bit less of a disadvantage, I guess you could say, in speed in relation to the other categories. So now you're looking at worst 2/3 the speed of others for most cases once you factor in engines, instead of looking at like maybe half as fast as others. So again, rather minor shift, but in any case, I feel like this is not anything that I'm upset with. I'm on top of the other changes. I'm actually really looking forward to this because again, on paper, I feel like it's reasonable, it's fair, it's going to help with again categorization, and I don't feel like it was touching anything that didn't really need to be tweaked in the past. I mean, the only outlier currently is really the Torero, but I mean, it makes sense as a supercar. It was meant to sort of be in its own category, I think, to begin with, compared to the other semi-lights. And then the Step Spider, and like I said, that you can look at that as a direct result of it being a sort of tank cabin again. So, I mean, maybe looking at the other categories, the lower tiers would have you come to some sort of other conclusion, but I feel pretty happy with this update overall. So looking at this and saying, okay, this sort of all makes sense and is what is in line with what I'd expect for changes in the values that I'd want to see from stuff if they were to do this sort of thing. I mean, I look at the update now and it's like, okay, well, this is purely good news. Like, I'm not really not a fan of any of them. I was somewhat skeptical, kind of hopefully optimistic about this change, and I wasn't sure where it was actually going before actually doing all this analysis. So I think actually going through it, I am happy with the results, and it is sort of in line with what I expect, which is simplifying things for users and hopefully correcting the need for speed for most cases of fighting where it feels like speed is the absolute paramount component. Now, there's maybe a little bit less of that. Is it noticeable enough to completely change the meta alongside the wedge changes? I'm not sure. I doubt it. A 50% speed increase over the other cabins is definitely still going to be noticeable, especially on the larger maps, maybe not so much in Arena. But if these aren't getting dropped until after Arena ends anyway, which seems to be the case since Arena is ending in 5 days, even after its extension, and they're just starting to test it now, I think it could be quite good for the game, and alongside the other quality of life changes. So, yeah, we'll have to see what this ends up looking like in execution, but in practice, I am quite happy with the changes.